Thank you enormously. It's very, 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 very good to be here. Thanks to Mary Evelyn and to Mary Lou and to everybody at Timothy Dwight and at Yale for having me. It was good fun to arrive on campus and see all the posters that were up. And they had a big picture of me in a t-shirt, and across the top it said in big letters, "Simply too hot." And I must say that conforms with my self-image completely, and it's so rare that people recognize it. I did worry when I saw it that you all would think that I was just a pretty face, you know? And that's why I made sure that my wife came with me. Where's Sue's here someplace? There she is. She's the actual beauty in our family, but also the brains. She was a graduate of this institution of Morse College, and then she was the first female Rhodes Scholar in the country. That's all of which is to say, all of which is to say, since the president was talking about IQs today, I just want you to know that the mean IQ of our household is very high, and if there are any problems you have with me, I want you to take them up with Sue afterwards, okay? You've heard a great deal about climate here in recent weeks, and my guess is that most of you are on board with the basic proposition that climate change is a deep problem and that we need to do something about it. And in that, you are like most people in this country and in this world. The polling data shows that quite clearly. Donald Trump notwithstanding, and more on him later, this intellectual argument about the existence of climate change is largely one, a consensus established within the scientific community long ago. So today, I want to try and advance the discussion a little further beyond that. The question, the word that I want to highlight here today, the focus of my remarks, will be the word pace. Okay? How fast are we going to deal with this crisis? And I'll try to do that in 5 parts. The first is to describe the pace of this unfolding crisis to date. I did, as Mary Evelyn said, write the first book about this back in 1989, which I am well aware was before many of you were born. At that time, we knew that we were in trouble. We understood that when you burned coal and gas and oil, you put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. We knew that the molecular structure of CO2 trapped heat that would otherwise radiate back out to space. What we did not know then was how fast this was going to happen and how hard it was going to pinch. And the story of the last 30 years is it's happening much faster and pinching much harder than people would have guessed. The most commonly used phrase by scientists in papers over the last 10 years has probably been faster than expected. The things that we're seeing now, the phenomenon playing out around the world, were things that 30 years ago we would have guessed would have happened late in this century. But as it turned out, the pace of climate change, the world was more finely balanced than we understood. So far, we have raised the temperature of our Earth 1 degree Celsius, 1.7 or so degrees Fahrenheit. That doesn't sound like an enormous amount, but in the context of the planet, it turns out to be quite large. We could express it in other units if we wanted to, and that might make it easier. Each day, the carbon that we've put in the atmosphere traps the heat equivalent of 400,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs, okay? That's enough heat to do enormous things, and we can see them now unfolding. More than half of the summer sea ice in the Arctic is gone. Think about how much heat it takes to melt a continent-sized, millennia-old, meters-thick sheet of ice to turn it from white to blue. The planet looks, from a satellite, entirely different than it did 40 years ago. There is a lot less white up top. We're an ocean planet. 70% of our surface is the sea. And the sea we have forced to undergo astonishing changes in the most blink of an eye. Some of the carbon that we've poured into the atmosphere is absorbed in the seawater, and as it is absorbed, it changes the chemistry of that seawater. The ocean is roughly 30% more acidic than it was 40 years ago. That combination of extra heat and different chemistry in the ocean is now wreaking violent damage. Sue and I were in the far Pacific 18 months or so ago with our colleagues at 350 in the Pacific who do amazing work trying to protect those low-lying islands. But we happened to be there when the wave of warm water in 2017, the warmest year ever recorded on this planet, when that wave of warm water swept over the course of a couple of weeks across the Pacific and the Indian Oceans, and as it did so, it wiped out 50, 60, 80, in some places 100% of the coral reefs around those atolls and islands. The Great Barrier Reef is the largest living structure on our planet, but it is half as living as it was 18 months ago. You can see the way that heat is expressed in the way that hydrological cycles around the planet have changed, the way that water moves. If you wanted one fact to hold in your mind to understand this century, it would probably be that warm air holds more water vapor than cold. That means that in arid areas, you get far more evaporation and far more drought. As you know, we meet today while our countrymen in California are coping with what looks like it may turn out to be one of, if not the biggest firestorms that's ever hit that state. That whole cities that 36 hours ago were intact are now in ashes. That's the kind of thing we see more and more of all over the planet. Once that water has evaporated up into the atmosphere, it is going to come down. The average residence time for a molecule of water vapor in the atmosphere is only about 7 days. So when it comes down now, it comes down hard in deluge that we haven't seen before. The U.S. set the new record for the largest rainfall event in our history last month. When Hurricane Harvey came ashore in Texas, some places saw 54 inches of rain, 4.5 feet of rain. Think about that. We can see it in the way that wind, that storm has changed. The great cyclones and hurricanes of our earth draw their power from the heat in the first few meters of the sea's surface. When you raise the temperature of that water, you allow them to become more powerful. September, the month just concluded, September of this year was the most hurricane activity, what the scientists call accumulated cyclonic energy, that we've ever recorded in a month in the Atlantic. We saw what that meant in Puerto Rico when our countrymen and women there took the full brunt in the eye of a Category 5 hurricane, ripped diagonally across that country and devastated everything in its path. I'm sure that most of you already have. I hope that people, when they go home, will try to figure out something material to do to help people in the recovery from one of the greatest catastrophes we've ever witnessed in this country. We see the effect simply in the sheer heat that now envelops parts of this planet. A couple of times in the last 18 months, we've set the record for the highest reliably recorded temperature ever measured on this planet. In cities in Pakistan and in Iraq, big cities like Basra, the temperature has gotten above 129 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay? We're feeling warm today. It's 80 degrees out. Think what it would feel like to add 50 degrees to the temperature we're feeling now. People can't work when it's 129 degrees. People can't sleep when it's 129 degrees. People really can't live very long if it stays 129 degrees because your body simply can't cool off fast enough. When Paul Winter and Janet Ye were playing and summoning up the beauty of this world that we were born into, it is sobering to reflect on how much we have already changed that planet, how discordant some of those notes are already becoming on this earth. This is already the biggest thing that human beings have ever done, and the most unjust, because there's an almost perfect inverse relationship between how much of this trouble you caused and how quickly and how hard it comes after you. So that's the first consideration about pace. So far, we've done a lot of damage. The second consideration is what the pace of damage is likely to be in the years ahead. Even if all the nations of the world kept the promises that they made as part of the Paris Climate Accords. And of course, our nation, the largest contributor over time to carbon in the atmosphere, has already announced it will renege, break, go back on the promises it made in Paris, something that should cause every American a real pang of shame. But even if we kept those promises, the actions that countries have pledged are small enough and slow enough that the temperature of the earth would continue to rise something like 3.5 degrees Celsius in the lifetime of people in this room, 6 or 7 degrees. If indeed we allow that to happen, then we cannot have civilizations like the ones we are used to having. That is the bottom line. Those zones, when it becomes too hot for human beings really to successfully inhabit places, will expand steadily out from the equator till they cover a sizable portion of the Earth's surface. And as people retreat above them and below them to find some respite from the heat, they'll find a host of other problems, some of them extremely basic. We believe at this point that each degree increase in global average temperature should cut grain yields something like 10%. All right? So if I've told you that it's going to raise temperature 3 degrees, you can do the math in your head and figure out what that's going to be like on a planet with 7 billion headed for 9 billion people and less in the way of calories. We're already seeing dramatic rises in sea level, okay? Enough so that coastal cities are already threatened. There were pictures 3 days ago from Miami where there was a so-called king tide, the high tide of the year with the full moon, and water was in the streets of Miami Beach just like it had been when Hurricane Irma came through a couple of weeks before. But we've just begun to see what's going on. We've understood now that we are near tipping points in Greenland and in the West Antarctic, and that continental ice that's currently above rock is beginning to melt in much the same way that the sea ice has already melted. When that sea ice melted, it did not raise the sea any more than melting the ice in your drink sends it over the top. But when that ice that's above rock melts, it does indeed raise the sea's surface. We thought as recently as 2 or 3 years ago that we might get away with as little as a meter, 3 feet of sea level rise this century. Those numbers now seem very optimistic indeed, and we're looking at 2 or maybe 3 times that much, and then extending far on into the future, because the last time we let carbon dioxide get as high as it currently is, hundreds of thousands of years ago, the sea level settled many, many, many meters higher than it is now, high enough to make sure that we can't inhabit the coastal cities where so much of our population now lives, high enough to make sure that much of the world's richest farmland, the river deltas and plains, especially of Asia, will be underwater and unproductive. We worry that we're very near the tipping point because of that melt in Greenland, where the conveyor belt of ocean current that brings warmth north from the tropics will begin to slow or even collapse. An enormous effect. And we're worried, in fact, we're all but certain, that if we keep on this same path of pouring ever more carbon into the atmosphere, that the oceans will go from their current, already perilously acidified state into something much darker than that. A conference of marine biologists meeting a year and a half ago, at the end of the conference, published their joint report. They said that on current trends, we can expect an ocean that by century's end is, in their words, sour, hot, and choking. Okay? All of this means that we are at least in the beginning stages of what is likely to become the 6th great mass extinction event on this planet. We think that the other extinction events, even the most recent, have been driven at least in part by the same thing we're seeing now, the release of massive quantities of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as natural deposits of coal or gas or oil were burned by volcanic activity. Now it is us that is doing the burning, and we're doing it more quickly than we've ever seen in the geologic record. So that is the pace of the immediate future. This is what happens if we keep doing what we're doing now. If we keep on the pace that we congratulated ourselves at Paris for getting on, okay? That's what happens. Which brings me to the third section, a nicer one. The possible pace of the future is very different. We have been given a great gift in the last decade. The engineers have done their job and done it very, very well indeed. The price of a solar panel has fallen 80% in the last decade. Around the world, most places, wind energy is now the cheapest way that we can produce electrons. That means that we're, because of that gift of the engineers, at the outer edge of possible, of changing those numbers very dramatically, of moving far beyond what people talked about in Paris. Mark Jacobson and his team at Stanford have produced plans for 139 nations around the world, and really all the ones with significant carbon footprints, showing that by 2030, in all of them, we could be generating 80% of the power that we use from the sun, from the wind, and from water, from hydroelectricity. It would take an extraordinary amount of work to do that, but if we did, we would be very much on the path to upsetting that math, to getting way ahead of the pace that we'd set for ourselves. And there are tantalizing glimpses around the world of places that are making it happen. If you go to Denmark, you will find them generating half their power from the wind. Either the sly and crafty Danes have figured out a way to steal the world's wind supply for themselves, or they have figured out how to take advantage of the same resources available to all of us. The resource they've added is the political will to make it happen and happen fast. I had the extraordinary pleasure of being in pretty remote rural parts of Africa for a good portion of the spring, doing some reporting for the New Yorker. I was in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, and then across to East Africa and Tanzania, looking at villages that have never had power and really would not have gotten it at best for several lifetimes if they were waiting on the grid to slowly expand. There's still more than 1 billion people on this planet without power. More people lack electricity now than lacked electricity the day that Thomas Edison invented the light bulb. Okay? Almost all of them in Africa, or a lot in Asia, but the bulk in Africa. It was incredibly beautiful to see those places come literally to light for the first time because solar panels had gotten cheap enough that the 30 cents a day that people were spending for the kerosene to run one guttering lamp that filled their house with smoke would now leverage, through the miracle of small amounts of credit, a solar panel on the roof and an inverter on the wall and 4 or 5 LED lights and a cell phone charger and maybe a small television. I sat one day, hot day, much hotter than this, in Ghana with the elders of a village that had just turned on this solar microgrid in their village. 40 or 50 small houses there, huts were now wired for the first time, and these elders of this village were obviously very happy, and they kept giving me bottles of cold water to drink, which I was grateful for because it was very hot. It took me, in my clueless American way, a few minutes to figure out why they were quite so proud and happy to be giving me bottles of cold water. Until 2 weeks before, there had never been anything cold in that village. Okay? That was the first time. It was beautiful to see that, and beautiful to reflect that it came from the entirely benign process of pointing a sheet of black glass at the sky and letting the sun's beams be transmuted into light and into cold and into all the things that people need for a full life. That miracle is not one that we should take for granted at all. This is J.K. Rowling stuff. You can point a piece of glass at the sky and the electrons come out the other end. That should allow us to change absolutely everything. But at the moment, we're not really making use of it. We're not doing it anywhere near fast enough to even begin to catch up with physics. Yes, by the end of the century, there will be solar panels and windmills supplying most of our energy. Free is a hard business proposition to beat, okay? But at the pace we are doing it, those solar panels and windmills will be powering a busted world. Our job is to make it go much faster. So the fourth reflection about pace is, why are we moving so slowly? Given that we have the biggest crisis we've ever faced as a planet, and given that we have a powerful solution at hand, why are we not putting it to use with the speed with which we should? And here, I confess, is the part of the story that took me a very long time, too long. I kicked myself to think about how long it took me to understand. When I was 27 or 28 and wrote The End of Nature, I believed that we were engaged in an argument about climate change, and being a good writer and academic, I believed that the way one proceeds in arguments is to write more articles and hold more symposiums. Perhaps some of the rest of you have engaged in that work too. And in most cases, it's exactly right. But in this case, We'd won the argument. The argument had been settled. By the middle of the 1990s, the world's scientists had come together in robust consensus about what to do. Okay? We'd won the argument, but we were losing the fight because it was not about data and reason and so on. It was a fight, as most fights are, about money and about power. And the fossil fuel industry, the richest industry the world has ever seen, had enough money and enough power to, despite having lost the argument, continue to win the fight. They were clearly willing to, their hope is to extend their business model another 2 or 3 decades, and they are willing to do it even at the cost of breaking the one planet we have. That sounds hyperbolic and unkind to say. I might not have said it even a few years ago, except that beginning about 2015 or so, great investigative reporters at the LA Times and the Columbia Journalism School and Inside Climate News and other places began producing a series of the most remarkable exposés, probably the most important journalism anyone's done about anything for a very long time. What they demonstrated beyond any doubt from document troves, from interviews with whistleblowers, was that the fossil fuel industry, its biggest players, particularly Exxon, the single biggest fossil fuel company, nay, the biggest company on Earth for much of the last 50 years, had known everything that there was to know about climate change and known it by the late 1970s or the early 1980s. They had all the money on Earth, they had superb scientists, their product was carbon, they set to work to find out what was happening, and they found out. Their scientists told them how much it was going to heat and how fast, and they were correct. And their management believed them. Exxon started building all its drilling rigs to compensate for the sea level rise that they knew was coming. They started mapping out the parts of the Arctic they knew would soon be melting so they could get the leases to drill there. What they didn't do was tell any of the rest of us. Instead, they spent the next 3 decades spending hundreds of millions of dollars to build the architecture of deceit and denial and disinformation that has kept us locked in a completely phony debate over the critical generation, the generation that may, in many ways, cost us much of what we value on this planet. There has never been a corporate crime of that magnitude. Had they merely said in 1989, or when Jim Hansen was testifying before Congress about the existence of global warming, had Exxon merely said, you know what, our scientists found the same thing, no one would have accused them of being climate alarmists. People would have said, okay, this is a problem, and we best get to work on it. We wouldn't have solved it by now, because it's a very big problem, but we would be well on the way to solving it instead of moving rapidly in the other direction. Instead, this blizzard of disinformation succeeded so well, I think even beyond their wildest dreams, to the point where we now have a president of the United States who apparently sincerely believes, that climate change was a hoax invented by the Chinese. Okay? That is incorrect. Okay? Their plan, their goal, which we know too from all these documents, is not to forever forestall, is just to make the conversion as slow as possible, to raise as much doubt, to put as much mud in the water as possible, to keep us from acting as swiftly as we need to act. What do I mean by mud in the water? Let me show you a picture. That's from a group called the Heartland Institute. Originally set up with money from Exxon, funded by all kinds of various fossil fuel groups that devoted themselves to climate denial over the years. This was a set of billboards that they set up around the country. And they took famous mass murderers and put pictures of them next to this. They had one about Charles Manson, too. I still believe in global warming, do you? And that's Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, a horrible figure in our history, one that Yale has had far too much knowledge of, you know. The legend, the billboard makes no sense, logical sense whatsoever. I mean, it's like putting up a picture of Hitler and saying, I believe in gravity, do you, you know? But its emotional meaning is clear. Climate scientists are crazy serial killers who are trying to wreck your life, okay? That's the level at which this campaign has been conceived and carried out. As it turned out, the day that those by surprise went up, we at 350.org just happened to have that same weekend, we do these huge global days of action with rallies and things around the world, and we had one set for that time. And we called it Connect the Dots, and it was for people in places all over the world who had already felt the sting of climate change to be rallying in those places. And so we were happy that same weekend to show what the real face of climate change looked like. There were 3,000 of these rallies. The day begins in the far Pacific, so there were people down in the Marshalls on their coral reef, you know, talking about its destruction. You would think that people in Afghanistan had worse things to worry about, but the Kabul River drying up is a big deal. All over the world, the pain of drought. Some places the problem's, you know, less life-threatening. But, you know, the disappearance of the seasons for those of us who psychologically mark our lives by them is a big deal, and one that hurts and should hurt. Those guys are in the part of Siberia where we now see forest fires 3, 4, 5 degrees of latitude north of where we've ever seen them before, and we see them routinely. Last year, Canada had to evacuate the biggest city in the north, Fort McMurray. 100,000 people had to leave their homes down a single road because of wildfire that destroyed much of the city. People literally having to leave their homes forever. That's Micronesia. These people's houses are now wet. They can't live in them anymore. By the way, as we're going through, I could literally show you these pictures all day and all night because there's 75,000 of them in our Flickr account, and you're welcome to go look at it. One of the things that's most compelling about them, and that struck me, I'd spent my whole life hearing that environmentalism was something that rich white people did, and if you didn't know where your next meal was coming from, you wouldn't be an environmentalist. It was very early on into the process of this work that we realized, just from looking at the pictures coming in from all over the world in day after day of action, that almost everybody we were working with was poor and black and brown and Asian and young, because that's what almost the whole world is composed of, okay? That's who the leaders of this movement are. It must be said that it has crossed my mind once or twice that rich white people might be slightly more the problem than the solution, okay, to some of our woes. But we will leave that for the moment. The pictures were amazing. If it wasn't drought, then it was flood. These people are in the part of Pakistan that in 2010 saw the greatest flood since Noah. It rained so hard in the Khyber Pass that by the time that water had trickled down, 25% of Pakistan was underwater. 20 million people were out of their homes. And if you look at them, it does not take much imagination to know that they are not the cause of the problem that they are the victim of. Okay? What these people are demonstrating is what our job is at this point, and this is the fifth and final section of this talk. Our job is to speed up the pace at which we make this transition, to act as accelerants in this process, to figure out each one of us in our lives and in our organizations how to build the movements that push hard enough to make this change happen fast enough to matter. I show you that picture because it's not a big demonstration. It might be the smallest one that we ever had, but it's just 6 kids or 7 kids in a street in Lake in Haiti that turned into a river in a storm. I show it to you for 2 reasons. One is the sign that those kids are holding. Your actions affect me, which is true. We've seen what happened to the Caribbean this last month with islands literally obliterated. There's nobody living on the island of Barbuda anymore. People have been there for hundreds of years, but now there is no one there because there is no place to live. Your actions affect me, but not vice versa. There's nothing that anyone in Lake can do to materially affect the outcome of this problem. They can't burn less fossil fuel because they don't burn any now. They can't come to the gates of the White House and try to convince the world's sole superpower to do the honorable thing because we don't let them into the country to come do that kind of thing. Okay? They can't divest their holdings in fossil fuel companies because I would wager that the entire pool of investment capital in the entire island of Haiti is considerably smaller than the Yale endowment. All right? It is our job now as institutions, as societies, as communities, to seize this and work before it is too late. The year after that was taken, Hurricane Matthew swept through the Caribbean. It did some damage up in the Carolinas, but the real damage it did was in the southwest peninsula of Haiti. 80% of the buildings in Lake were destroyed. I have no idea if those kids are still alive or not, because a lot of people died in the course of that hurricane, okay? Too late for them. That's why we have to pick up the pace. And especially now that we have Donald Trump in Washington, there is no fallback argument for inaction. No sense that someone else is somehow going to take care of it. There are a number of ways in which we can do that work of picking up the pace. We help organize this whole big effort to, as we say, keep it in the ground, to keep fossil fuel where it is by blocking every proposed plan for a pipeline or a coal port or a new fracking well or whatever, coal mine, whatever it is. And those fights, which really began with the battle over the Keystone Pipeline in 2011, a battle not yet settled, but which for 7 years we've managed to keep 800,000 barrels a day of the dirtiest oil underground. Thank you to all who took part in that. That battle has now spread. People saw that one could stand up to the fossil fuel industry, and so now every one of those projects is met with resistance, and often it works. We've blocked all kinds of pipelines. TransCanada announced last week that it was pulling the plug on its plans for an even bigger pipeline out of the tar sands to the Atlantic in Canada. Just last week, Scotland became the, I think, 14th country in the world to ban fracking. We had a huge day of action 3 days ago in Australia with 45 huge demonstrations against plans for what would be the biggest coal mine on planet Earth. I am all but certain that we're going to be able to beat it because the rise of popular protest is so strong. So keep it in the ground. If there are those things happening and you can figure out how to join in that work, then you should. We have massive campaigns going on across the environmental movement now, many groups led really by the Sierra Club to get cities and towns and counties and states here and around the world to commit to 100% renewable energy. And that is beginning to work in a big way. At first, of course, it was Berkeley and Madison, Wisconsin that signed up, But now it's Atlanta and it's San Diego and it is Salt Lake City. When Trump pulled us out of the Paris Climate Accord, he said, I was elected to govern Pittsburgh, not Paris. The next day, the mayor of Pittsburgh said, thank you very much, we've decided to go 100% renewable in our city. So keep it in the ground. And this fight for renewable energy to provide the stimulus, the subsidy, the pace to make sure that it happens fast. And one of the other fights is to try and interfere with the financing of the fossil fuel industry. That's why this divestment fight has been so important around the world. It went much better than we ever thought it would when we launched it 5 years ago now, I guess. And at this point, there are endowments and portfolios with assets of about $6 trillion that have divested from fossil fuel. Earlier this week, 40 big Catholic institutions chose St. Francis's feast day to divest their holdings, and they included the Diocese of Assisi, which was a beautiful moment in this struggle. The hardest places to convince have been the rich elite universities on the East Coast of the United States. All right? My alma mater, Harvard, I'm not sure it will ever divest. Its ties to Wall Street are so strong, although there are people here who are trying hard to make it happen. We will not stop. Instead of my reunion last time, I got to spend the night in a sleeping bag in the shrubbery outside the president's office as part of a big sit-in around the thing, and it was much better than the reunion, I must say. It's not okay at this date for places like Yale to have hundreds of millions of dollars invested in this stuff. It's not okay. If it is wrong to wreck the planet, then if it is wrong to wreck the planet, then it is wrong to profit from that wreckage. The profit from that wreckage is very small. Any institutions that took the advice of students 5 years ago and divested have made out like bandits because the fossil fuel sector has underperformed every other part of. But it also means the other reason not to be engaged in that work is, remember that picture I showed you about the Unabomber? If you're in bed with those companies, then you are engaged in the process of undermining our democracy, of spreading lies constantly. You're saying and doing things that would get you kicked out of Yale for violating the honor code if you did them on a test or a paper, okay? It's not any different if you do them with the money that you invest. And now, especially that we have Donald Trump in office and so many people are saying how sad they are about that, now especially is the time for people to understand that we need to act at every other level that we can act at, because nothing is going to happen in Washington, at least for the next few years. So it'd be a good idea to go have dinner in Silliman Annex with all the good people from Fossil Free Yale who are organizing hard, and thanks to them for keeping up this fight going forward. And they are by no means alone. There is resistance underway every place around the world now, as I say, and it's beautiful to watch, and it comes from everywhere. So much leadership provided by frontline communities, and especially, I think most gratifyingly over the last 5 years, by this rapid emergence to the leadership of indigenous traditions around the world. You saw what happened at Standing Rock last autumn, a beautiful, beautiful, powerful gathering. It didn't surprise me because the people who organized it, we've been working with for years. They are great leaders. It's a good sign that the oldest, I was saying this to someone at lunch, that the oldest wisdom tradition on the planet, indigenous wisdom tradition is meshing now powerfully with the newest, that the word that comes from the sweat lodge and the word that comes from the supercomputer is the same word about what we need to be doing, okay? And now people gather in their numbers. You know, these were 400,000 people on the march in New York City a couple of years ago. Until the Women's March at the beginning of January, the biggest marches about anything in this country in a very long time. And it wasn't just in this country, it was as usual all over the entire world. I think I want to close just showing you a couple of pictures that illustrate, in my mind, the kind of drama of this moment in which we find ourselves, okay? You know, there are sort of tropes that go on in one's, that fit the human mind, our image of, and one of them is the battle of the small against the very large, okay? The David and Goliath story. These are our friends in the Pacific, in those islands like Vanuatu and Tuvalu and the Marshalls and Micronesia and the Solomons that'll probably be underwater by the end of the century. But boy, people, their slogan is, "We are not drowning, we are fighting," and boy, they are. While we were marching in New York, they'd cut down on each island a single tree and made a big traditional war canoe, and they took them to Newcastle in the Pacific, which is the biggest coal port in the world. And there they used them for a day to blockade that port and keep the largest ore ships in the world in harbor so they couldn't come out without running them over. It was brave and beautiful action. It's been one of the reasons that's galvanized Australians into opposing this crazy plan for this giant coal mine. And it illustrated perfectly this trope, the small and the many against the few and the very big. We saw the same image from the Pacific Northwest the next year. This was when Shell Oil announced that they were going to go drill for oil in the Arctic. Okay, think about that for 1 minute, by the way. Okay, scientists had said, if you warm the planet, the Arctic will melt. Shell Oil and its ilk paid no attention and went ahead, and what do you know, the Arctic melted. Having looked at that, did the leadership of Shell Oil say, maybe we should go into the solar business instead, this seems not to be working out? No, the leadership of Shell Oil said, hey, it's melted up there now, it will be easier to drill for more oil. If you were looking for an illustration to support the argument that the big brain was not a good adaptation, okay, that would be it seems to me. On the scale of human folly, it doesn't get much larger, but happily, there were lots of people with perfectly good brains and big hearts attached to them who decided to get in the way. And in Seattle and in Portland, for days, they blockaded the two giant drilling rigs with small craft. We called them kayaktivists, okay? And it was beautiful. And it threatened brand damage to Shell that was more than they could contend with. And by the end of the year, Shell said, well, we didn't find enough oil in the Arctic, we're going home. Really what they'd found was far more trouble than they could deal with. And so they turned tail and ran, and that was a very good moment. But we need lots more moments like that. I guess the way to say this is, the planet is now way, way outside its comfort zone. That's what it means when the Arctic is melting, when coral is dying. Because it is way, way outside its comfort zone, We need to be outside our comfort zones too. We need to be doing much more than we are doing now, because it is manifest that what we are doing now is insufficient. That's why the temperature keeps going up. Okay? Now, what exactly it means to be outside your comfort zone will be different for different people. But since we were over at the forestry school earlier today, I was reminded, I told the students there a story about one of my great friends and heroes, Gus Speth, who was the dean of that institution for a long time and built that magnificent building there and so on. Gus Speth was one of the great environmentalists, is one of the great environmentalists that this nation has ever seen. He helped found the Natural Resources Defense Council and won many of the lawsuits that helped us begin the process of environmental regulation. He was the first head of the President's Council on Environmental Quality, so he worked the system from Washington, from the inside. He went to the UN, where he ran the United Nations Development Program, the whole thing. So he worked the global bureaucracy from the inside. Then he came and became a dean at Yale, at which there is no higher possible accomplishment. And then, when he retired, he wrote a book looking back on his life, and it was a kind of sad book in a way, because what he said was, none of the kind of inside obvious normal things that I did very, very well, better than anybody else, added up to enough. They didn't begin to make the kind of change that we need to make. When I was recruiting people to come to Washington for the civil disobedience action that launched the Keystone Fight, which became the largest civil disobedience action in 30 years in this country about anything, it sent 1,200 and some people to jail. One of the first people that I called was Gus Speth and said, will you sign this letter with me and will you come to Washington? And he said, yes, I will. Thank you very much. He and I were arrested on the first day of that protest, and because the police were trying to send a message to the others that were coming behind, they treated us somewhat more harshly than usually people who are charged with failure to yield are treated. We spent 3 days in Central Cell Block in D.C., which is as much fun as it sounds like it would be, okay? Gus was on the next cell over, so we could speak through the bars, and we talked a lot. In fact, for the 50 or 60 people who were there, he gave a lecture through the cell bars about his new book, and it was excellent. But he, because his son was a Whiteshoe Lawyer who was papering the jailhouse with writs, he was the only one of us who got out even for a couple of minutes. They let him go meet his son, shackled, but he got to go talk to his son briefly. And he passed him a message to pass to the reporters. And what he said was, and I think that this bears thinking about for elites of all kinds, which anybody who is at this institution is. What he said, the only sentence he said was, I've occupied a lot of important positions in this city, and none of them seem as important as the one I'm in right now. Okay? That, I think, bears thinking about as we decide what we're going to do. You don't all have to go get arrested, although an increasing number of people have explained to me that it's now on their bucket list, okay? And I will add, looking at the great age diversity in this audience, when I wrote the letter asking people to come to get arrested there, I said, I don't think young people should have to be the cannon fodder in this case. They're doing most of the leading in this movement, as you've seen from the pictures. But if you're 22, it's possible an arrest record might not be the best item for your resume, okay? One of the few unmixed blessings of growing older is, past a certain point, what the hell are they going to do to you, you know? And so it was with pleasure that we saw people with hairlines like mine descend on Washington. We did not say, how old are you? That would be rude. But we did cleverly, I think, say, who was president when you were born, okay? And the two biggest cohorts were from the FDR and the Truman administrations. On the last day, a man was arrested with a placard around his neck that said, World War II veteran, handle with care. He was so old he had been born in the Warren Harding administration, which was so long ago I'd forgotten there was a Warren Harding administration. It was good for the young people who were there to see their elders acting in the way that really elders need to in a working civilization. Right? I will just add that this same principle of risk, since we're at a university, goes triple for anyone with tenure, okay? You guys are the most bulletproof people in any place on earth. Put it to good use. We also told people if they wanted to get arrested that they should wear a necktie or a dress. Not because we're big into formal wear. Sue and I live in Vermont, which I believe has a constitutional provision exempting people from wearing neckties, okay? We wanted to make the same visual point that I've been trying to make throughout this talk. There is nothing radical about what we are talking about. All we are asking for is a world a little bit like the one that we were born onto. A little bit of ice at the top and the bottom, the odd coral reef in the middle. That's not a radical demand. That is a conservative demand. Radicals work at all companies. If you get up in the morning willing to make your fortune by altering the chemical composition of the atmosphere, and you are willing to do it after scientists have told you it will happen, and if you're willing to keep doing it after you've seen it happening, then you are a radical in a way we have not had on this planet before, and our job is to check that radicalism. And it is our job to check it fast, because that's the only way that matters. Climate change is the first time-limited challenge humans have ever really had to face, okay? Dr. King would always end his talks by saying, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. This may take a while, but we're going to win. The arc of the physical universe is short, and it bends toward heat. If we do not win soon, then we will not win ever. And that is why pace has become the most important word, why fast is the only thing that really matters. If you remember no other line from this talk, remember this: when it comes to climate change, winning slowly is a different way of losing. Okay? Because that's what we're doing now. We are winning very, very slowly, and that is just another way of losing. I cannot guarantee you that we will win this fight even if we do everything right. We have waited a long time to get started. It is a bad sign that the world's ice sheets are rapidly disintegrating, that the chemistry of seawater is changing. I cannot guarantee you that. We do not know, though the best science indicates there is still a narrow window, narrow and closing, that we should be able still perhaps to prop open. The only thing I can guarantee you is that there is going to be a real fight, and you've seen it in all these pictures from all over the world. I am so grateful to those who have been engaged in this fight for a long time, and I am so grateful to all the reinforcements that I know are coming from so many other quarters. It will be a great privilege to get to stand shoulder to shoulder with you all. Thank you very much. Thank you all.